I think the best way to describe the next one is that in the blue corner, we have George. I think it's very interesting, and unfortunately, Martin Elliott, who was here earlier, had to disappear, but he was actually brought in to look at a similar situation in China, where they were harvesting organs from the Muslim Uyghurs to do transplantation in Chinese people, and it's still going on. They had a big tribunal about it, and he was on the panel that got involved. So it's a very emotive subject. But the whole idea is bittersweet, because there are people on the other side that need the organs, and we should welcome you into expand on that.
Thank you. First of all, my disclosures. I think we don't really have to worry about organ migration into the United States. There certainly cannot stop recreational medicine where people travel outside of the country to receive that, but there's certainly lots of safeguards in the United States to prevent that. Let's look at some of the numbers and clarify a few things that my esteemed colleague here has given you. As of October 2023, there are 103,000 patients on the organ waiting list in the United States. Every single day, 30 people die waiting on the transplant list in the United States. I know this personally, where I just had a close family member die just a week ago waiting for a lung transplant. Every 8 minutes, a new patient is added to the organ waiting list. So in the time for this conversation today, 16 people will be added to the organ waiting list, or the transplant list in the United States. The average number of patients who are treated with a single DCD NRP run in our experience at the University of Colorado is 3.5. So 3.5 patients benefit from a single NRP run in our experience. And as we know, there's a big gap between the number of patients waiting on the organ list and the transplants that are actually performed or available to them. And if we look at the UNOS regions across the United States, even in the high transplant centers like Region 2, Region 3, for example, the rate of growth in DCD organ donation is outpacing the rate of brain dead donations. In my region, which is Region 8 in Colorado, it has significantly outgrown the number of organs available from 2017 to 2021. Matter of fact, this is a better way to look at it. This is a density plot of the number of DCD donations by states. And in Colorado, 32% of all donors are DCD, right? So let's talk about the pathways to donations. There's a traditional pathway, right, which goes through what we classically think of as the brain death process, or the DBD process. In that process, I don't know if any of you have been able to participate in organ donation in brain dead patients, but the patient's brought to the operating room, right? Their heart is beating, they're on the ventilator, and that continues throughout the process of the organ donation, right? So the sternotomy is made, or the abdominal is made, incision is made, and they're still have native cardiac function, and are still being mechanically ventilated, right? In the DCD process, what happens, a patient comes to the operating room, and we withdraw support, withdraw the ventilator, and the patient is allowed to experience a natural cardiac death. Unlike, as previously described, there's not a time limit to the time we wait for that cardiac death. It is dependent on the individual hospital's protocol and their definition of what we call the warm ischemic time. So that process can be a few minutes in some patients. It can be up to 120 minutes. If that patient does not experience a natural cardiac death, they are taken back up to the intensive care unit, still off of life support. You don't put them back on the ventilator, and they're allowed to continue their natural dying process, okay? If that natural death, that cardiac death, occurs within that time window, then we go into the normothermic regional perfusion. We talk a lot about machine perfusion or OCS systems, right? And I think we should clarify that. I mean, OCS is a method of preservation, right, and organ support. And it can be used across all of these platforms. You can use OCS in traditional brain death organ procurement. You can use it also in the DCD process. And it can also be used as a supplement along with normothermic regional perfusion. So really what we're talking about in NRP process is to limit the ischemic, warm ischemic damage from the time after the natural cardiac death till we have organ recovery, right? And that is to increase the donor pool, decrease the wait list time and morbidity, increase the transplant volume, and more importantly, improve the function of the recovered organ. So where things get fuzzy, right, is what do we call, or what is our definition of death? So let's revisit this dead donor rule. And I think I agree with my colleague and everyone in medicine that this is a 40-year-old definition that certainly needs to be revisited under current modern science, right? So the dead donor rule is part of the Uniform Determination of Death Act. And it says that death is an individual who has sustained either one, irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem, is dead, right? So as Dr. Said said, there's only one kind of death. When you're dead, you're dead. But there's two different ways to determine death in the law, right? So part of the problem with this definition for the dead donor rule is cessation of all functions of the entire brain. So what are some protections that's different in DCD donation, right? So the first one is it requires primary consent. And by primary consent, we mean that the patient has either signed an advance directive, driver's license, living will, given authority to some designated legal representative to donate organs, right? The second thing is it requires irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function. And that is to prevent autoresuscitation. And that's the whole purpose of the no-touch time, right? So from natural cardiac death, before recovery, there is a no-touch period. And that no-touch period, in my experience, varies between 2 and 10 minutes. And that's not determined by the recovery team. That is determined by the center where the organ recovery is occurring. So the hospital, in their own internal ethics, in their own internal review, have their own protocols on what is acceptable no-touch period for DCD, and we have to honor that. Part of this whole discussion about cardiac death and what is appropriate removal of life support equipment comes from a case that back in the 70s, and some of you may know this case, Karen Ann Quinlan, right? So Karen Ann Quinlan was a person who was in a vegetative comatose state, and there was a long, protracted legal battle about removing life support from her between her husband and her parents, right? Went on for a long time. But the conclusion ultimately of that case was the court's ruling that withdrawing life support is not the cause of death. It simply allows the patient to die. And the underlying pathology is the cause of death. And that's the same standard that we apply to DCD donation, right? Removing the life support isn't accelerating the death or causing the death. It's simply allowing the patient to die in their own natural cardiac death. All right, so this concept of nearly dead applies to both brain dead and DCD donation, right? In DBD, or brain dead donation, since 1968, this concept of withdrawing life support and recovery of organs in patients with irreversible coma met the criteria for the universal definition of death. It's legally acceptable to have recovery of organs before the withdrawal of life support, right? And it involves this concept of dissolved somatic unity, right? Which is the lack of coordination between neurological function and organ function. In DCD, brain death occurs from the cessation of circulation, right? Which has occurred naturally in these patients. As long as there's no resuscitation of brain circulation and function, then the criteria of the DDR is met. Now, if we modernize this, if we move from 1980 to 2024, right, we have much more sophisticated standards and methods now for evaluating brain function. And we know that these higher standards of brain death that include permanently unconsciousness are also technically challenged, as we can find some cognitive function both in DBD patients and in DCD patients, right? But the concept of dissolved somatic unity has 4 types. There's damage to the target organ, while the brainstem remains the capacity to control function. That is not death. Number 2 is the disruption of the pathway between the brainstem and the organ, while both are functional. That is also not a legal definition of death. Number 3, destruction of the brainstem while the target organ is undamaged. And this is what we're doing in both DBD and DCD donation. And then number 4, of course, the loss of function of both the brainstem and the target organ, right? And those would not be viable transplantable organs. So some of the safeguards that we have in DCD donation is number 1, valid decision, right? So this is where the care team, in consultation with the patient or the patient's family, right, have gone through all the proper decisions to remove care and to honor these patients' primary consent. The second one is valid consent, so first person consent to do donation. And the third one is no conflict of interest, right? So no member of the transplant team can participate in the care of the donor or in the consent process. And matter of fact, to the point of it is completely no touch from the transplant team in even preparing the patient for their surgical organ recovery. So even simple things like helping to move the patient from the ICU bed to the OR table, right? We cannot participate in as a recovery team. We are completely no touch and not participating in any decisions that are made up to that point. Some intraoperative safeguards that happen in thoracic NRP, yes, we do isolate the brachiocephalic arteries prior to establishment of systemic circulation, right? So that's the other thing that needs to be understood. That isolation occurs before any mechanical circulation happens, right? And so that maintains the definition of death. We do monitoring of radial artery pressures, pulse oximetry to ensure that that isolation is complete, right? If we see any change in radial artery pressures or any resumption of evidence of oxygenation, then the procedure is stopped. And the third technique is directly venting the brachiocephalic arteries, right? So that we make sure there is no contralateral flow to the brain. The same is similar in abdominal NRP. There's direct aortic cross clamp and isolation. We monitor again radial artery pressures for integrity of the isolation, and we do direct venting of the aorta proximal to the cross clamp. These criteria still support and maintain the definition of cardiac death under the UDDA. So why is DCD donation important? One, it is a potential to increase the donor pool and save numerous lives. Number two, it gives hope and closure to the donor patient's family and meets their expressed wishes, right? So patients' families get a lot of comfort and relief to seeing that their loved one is contributing to saving someone's life. It reduces the warm ischemic damage. So we have reduced cytokines, pro-inflammatory agents, improved organ function, and it allows us time to do more thorough functional testing of the organs so that the recipient receives a better quality organ. And it meets all the criteria of circulatory death as we know it today. Thank you.
We've had so many comments, I've been trying to write them down and I can't keep up with everybody's comments online. Oh God, who put me down to sort this one out? Really interesting discussion. And it's great to hear two different takes on the same thing. Whilst I invite people up to ask some questions, I'm just going to give you a bit of feedback of what's been going on, because it's, you know, like I say, I can't keep up with all the comments. People were asking, well, what would you do? What's your vote? And there are some obviously coming out and saying no, yes, but the majority are saying, we just don't know. We don't know whether we're in favor or not, because it depends. I don't know if there can be a one size fits all. What do you say?
Well, you know, I think, you know, in our experience, you know, patients' families are well informed of the process, and patients' families are present during the process, right? So when we bring a patient for DCD donation, we get the patient in the OR, we get everything set, and then everyone leaves. And the patient's family is present during the death process. So they're there to see their loved one. They understand, you know, what is going to happen, what's going to happen to their loved one after the declaration of death, and they participate in that. So I think, you know, it's an individual, personal decision that these families make. and you have to honor that wish. And so I don't think that there's anything that is hidden from them or that is unethically kept from them, because they participate in the process. So, I think the ethics of it really comes down to a matter of personal choice.
Yeah. There you go. So I don't have a problem with DCD saving lives. I think it's great if you save lives. I have a problem with the process of determining death. And I know George says it's very graceful. You come into the OR, you disconnect the vent. To me, that's an intervention. You're disconnecting the ventilator. I know the family has said, okay, but to me, that's an intervention. And clamping the brachiocephalic artery is an intervention. And, we're not talking about semantics and medicine. We're talking about ethics. Are you 100% sure that not even 1% of this patient population may be alive? We don't know. So to me, it's a slippery slope by saying we're going to do it for the greater good. That's my thinking.
As a statistician, I've never been 100% sure of anything.
No, and I agree. You can't be 100% sure, but we're also not 100% sure in what we would classically call brain dead, right? Just because a brain stem is not functioning doesn't mean there's not other cognitive functions occurring in the brain. And so, in my view, it's a similar type process. Yes, there is the intervention of isolating blood flow to the brain, but that is a process that is well explained. Again, and it comes back down to personal choice. Not everyone who agrees to DCD donation agrees to the NRP procedure, right? So we're not capturing 100% of those DCD patients. And so it gets, again, back to family and individual selection.
And I just want to say, in my conversation with the transplant surgeons I know, a lot of them don't agree with it and don't do it. And they have specific reasoning for doing that. I spoke about it. And so I'm just saying the process should be transparent. I'm just saying there should be equity, there should be inclusion. And we as medical practitioners can be the decision makers only, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and that's why you say we've got to involve family. Question I would ask is, whilst you say it's personal choice for the parents or the family, when you've got individuals, practitioners, us, involved, who have strong feelings, perhaps against, where do we sit with saying, actually, that's something that you have to do because it's part of your job, or actually, we respect your right to have an opinion on this, and therefore, we don't expect you to do this? Again, because that's another slippery slope. What was your thinking on that?
So when we set up our program, it is completely voluntary, at least from the perfusion department. So every perfusionist has the ability to say, no, I don't want to participate in these types of procedures. It violates my ethics, my personal morals, etc. And it has to be voluntary. It can't be a requirement because it's part of your job description.
Yeah. Jim?
Yeah, just a quick question. I think it's great that we're having this conversation, and we're having it because we all care, right? We want to make sure we do the right thing, and it's good to have voices of dissent and support. I guess my question for you, Bharat, is kind of what's the, we would draw support on people all the time, right? That we're not going to get organs from. I guess for me, I'm having difficulty understanding, I get what you're saying, that that's an intervention, but if you're classifying that as an intervention, we kill people all the time. So I guess for me, that's not a line in the sand that should keep us from then moving forward with, harvesting the organs with appropriate consent.
Well, I think sometimes we keep patients alive too long on ECMO, right? So it's not the question of keeping them alive or not keeping, or a line in the sand. I just think it's the question of process. And I think that the process becomes murky when you have an intervention. That's my say here. The process becomes murky when someone can't breathe, even on a ventilator. There is no decision making there. But the moment you're going to take someone to the operating room, to me, even though you have consent, right, from the family, that person is not aware, at least as we know. And you're taking him to the OR, you're disconnecting the ventilator, you're clamping the brachiocephalic artery. Those are interventions to do something which is procuring an organ. To me, that's a conflict of interest. And if you're going to get by saying an intensivist signed off on it, I mean, he wants the bed or she wants the bed, you know. So those are my issues with the process currently.
Dave, go for it.
I really enjoyed this talk. I'm a big BD fan, so I really wanted to pull for you. So I started out with you, but then George made a great argument. But what I do want to go back to is you did say something, but then you haven't followed up on it. This is a really expensive process. Mm-hmm. The hospital I'm currently working at, we do some DCDs, we do the DVDs, and the hospital I'm at has about a 50% success rate getting a viable organ after we're saying, okay, we're going down this road. I just did one last week, and we get little snapshots on our phone app that show the process of this patient once we extubate them, okay? And we watched for 90 minutes, this patient's respiratory status stay the same for 90 minutes. So naturally they had to cancel, the whole thing. But what was the cost of sending an entire team there with the device? I have to think it's upwards of $50,000, the jet, the people, the surgeons, the equipment, and that sort of stuff. I did a quick Google search. The average cost of a heart transplant, a successful heart transplant, $1.3 million. Mm-hmm. So I know that NRP is taking off. There are companies starting up all over the country that are offering this service. And at what point are we going to have to start looking at, okay, this is ridiculously expensive, especially if I don't know what the overall, your success rate is with getting these organs, or how many of them fail to go to transplant or such. But just being at a hospital that has 50% success rate, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars a year that we're just throwing away that could probably be used better place. So then it comes down to subjectively, why are some of these people progressing to death where some of them aren't? Is there a difference in the definition of, okay, we're going to identify this person to go down this road? And is that the area we need to be looking at? Because I think wasting money on this, there's other places we can be spending our money.
Okay, so let's talk about the finances. All right. If you want to talk about wasting money, then we should be talking to all the OCS users, right? Right, because that's $80,000, right? There, where we're doing this for less than 10% of that cost, right? Now, recovery. If we look at thoracic organs, our recovery rate is about 90%. If we look at abdominal organs, it's about 75% right now. And about 20% of our patients, of our donors, I should say, do not proceed to cardiac death, right? So about 20% of your runs, there is no cardiac death in our experience to date, right? But functional recovery from this is much greater than any other mechanism, because we have the time now, right, while we're doing support, to do much more functional analysis, right? We do complete liver panel tests, and we look at bile production, and we look at cardiac function, and so it's a much more controlled environment, and that's why the success rate, I think, in NRP. From a global economic standpoint, though, I think it still pencils out because of the additional patients that we're able to transplant and support, and their total cost of care goes down.
That's all right. So I'm going to finish up. I'm going to end up on Team George. Sorry, BD. You got to bring more data. Less Saturday Night Live, and I think maybe next time.
I just want to say, Dave, that my concern is that the process of death declaration can be hurried because of the need for a bed, and we do need beds, because someone's in a hospital bed is costing us money. And to me, that's an ethical concern we have to look at, the potential of the process being hurried up.
I think there's a huge ethical consideration there, and I know that there are hospitals that won't touch this because of the ethical concerns. And I would love to see some kind of task force to really kind of bring everybody together at the table and come up with a universal definition of how we're going to do this, because it's painful to see, because the hospitals that don't participate in this are depriving their area of potential, life-saving donations and such. So now we're going to get back to the cultural, socioeconomic potentials.
This is and will create a huge discussion in our country among all of our medical professions. And it really comes back to revisiting that 40-year-old definition of death. And it's going to force us to re-examine that and to make it contemporary and add contemporary science into what that definition is. And it's going to be traumatic to have that conversation.
And that was kind of the point of actually having this session, was really to have that fairly difficult conversation. Thankfully, we're professionals. We're not going to take it out to a bar fight or anything stupid like that. But you need to have those discussions where different points of view happen.
Yes.
I think that the worst thing we can do is ignore it or not have a discussion about it, because unless you face these things, you can't make a decision. You can't have a rational thought. And that's kind of the why we're having it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say respectfully, George, I don't necessarily believe in the system. I mean, you can see what's happening with the election and all that stuff and the politics of it all. The system doesn't always work. So you can't depend upon the system all the time. There've got to be strict criteria.
Sorry, they just lowered the microphone for Carla, so that just amused me. Please carry on. Go on, Carla.
Okay, so thank you both so much. I can tell you that the virtual audience is having a field day with this one. And one of the questions that keeps arising is, how many times have you gone in to perform DCD that you left without an organ? And how many times has you been called in to do it and that patient left the hospital alive?
Well, I can tell you that about 20% of the time, we do not see cardiac death within the prescribed time period, okay? I cannot tell you how many of those patients survive after withdrawal, because we're not involved in that part of the care, right? So once the patients return to the ICU, if they did not have their cardiac death in the OR, I don't know that answer, how long that took, or if any of them survived. So I don't think anyone knows the answer to that one.
And it'd be interesting to sort of qualify that as well. It's not just a case of survival. What's the quality of life following it as well? Are we saying, yes, we're not using these organs, but these patients, they're recovering. They're in a vegetative state for the rest of their life, which could be a week or 10 years, all that kind of stuff. So qualifying that as well is quite difficult to do. So,
I assume from what I see in the operating room that none of those patients survive. It's just they needed a longer time period for the cycle to happen. But that's, like I said, I don't have any hard facts.
Yeah. Luke, last question. I mean, this could go on for hours and it's really interesting, but we need to
just have a remark. Like, I think what Dave was saying about cost, I think that is really an obsolete question about waste, because like the American healthcare system produces billions of dollars of waste every year. So I think that is like complete obsolete question. But during the discussion with Martin Elliott's presentation, we talked about advertising in healthcare. Like me, from a European standpoint, I'm like absolutely baffled by the amount of medication that is thrown on television every day. And I don't even watch television, but when I go to patients in their rooms, like they're just like, if you don't take medication, there's something wrong with you. But so I'm a child of the 70s. I don't know if you know the movie Soylent Green, but I'm waiting for the first advertisement like, are you a little bit tired of life? Are you not feeling okay? We got a solution for you, and if you don't mind if we take your organs. But my point is also like, should we keep patients alive in between brackets? And what kind of life is that? Because if I'm starting to having to eat my dinners through a straw, then I would like, you can take my life and take my organs and help someone who can still have a decent life.
Yeah, I'll agree with you that, I don't think we should ever, do mechanical life support with the hope of extending the time so that, organ recovery can happen in that patient. I think that does cross an ethical line. Like, the patient's caregivers and the patient's family need to independently come to the conclusion that this is the time to withdraw care, and that should not be influenced by any other outside factors, right? But to a previous comment that you made, right, about marketing and advertising, and that already happens in the transplant world, right? Patients are free to shop around, right, to what facility they go to get on the transplant list. You don't have to stay at your home hospital. If you're in California, you can come to Colorado, or you can go to Florida, or right, you can go to whatever hospital offers you the best chance of receiving that transplant. And that has occurred for decades in the United States. And patients do that. They shop around.
Or you could go to Mexico.
But I'm talking about the donors. I'm not talking
Yeah.
about the acceptors. I'm talking about donors.
That's interesting. I think, go on, one last question. Disappear.
Stated earlier that NRP was strictly voluntary for your perfusionists. So along similar lines, what about ECMO and withdrawal of care on ECMO circuits? Is that voluntary for your perfusionists as well?
Yes, it is. So if someone has an ethical problem with, discontinuation of ECMO support, we'll send someone else to do that.
Okay. I think we're going to finish there. Otherwise, like I said, we'll be here for hours, and I don't think we'll never solve it. But it's great to have that discussion. So thank you again to George and Barrett.
Good work, Joe. Nice to meet you.